Man, what a disaster that would be, right? Is if someone's able to basically view your life through your first person point of view. It's like a Black Mirror episode.
The primary feature of Halo, using an AI agent to enhance memory. How do you do that in a way that's not saving these memories in a ways that others could access, their potential dystopian effects?
That is sort of been a whole endeavor of ours, is getting some small models that do that inference over the rich media, the images and the audio, to get those running locally on your phone. So without needing to go up to a server. That is definitely not what our platform's about, and neither the intention nor the inadvertent accident that we would hope never happens. And so we design things so that it's just not even a possibility.
In this episode, I talked to Bobak Tavangar of Brilliant Labs. This is a company I've been fascinated with for several years because they're doing something incredibly hard, an AI hardware startup. Specifically, they're working on AI glasses and competing with trillion-dollar companies like Meta and Google. But Brilliant Labs is doing something different. They are building in public and making their software and hardware open source. They're also focusing their next product, the Halo glasses, around a very specific feature. It's a conversational AI agent for your long-term memories and conversations. This has all kinds of implications, but it's also focused around this goal of allowing you to be more present and intentional in the moment. And we had a great conversation about that, as well as how the company is handling privacy. Babak is one of the most thoughtful and purposeful entrepreneurs that I've ever met. And we also talked about the impressive ways that he communicates about his product and his company on social media. I'm continually amazed at how well he elevates conversations to the level of principle and purpose that transcend the technology itself. So here it is, our conversation with Bobak Tavangar of Brilliant Labs. Babak, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Jason. Great to be here.
Exciting stuff. Well, Babak, your company Brilliant Labs is doing some very interesting things with smart glasses and AI. But before we get into that, I'd love to talk a little bit about you and your journey to get where you are. You're a startup founder. You've worked for Apple. You had a startup before you went to Apple. So how did you get into this? How did you get into your work at founding a startup? How did you get into your work working on glasses and AI? Like, take us back how you got started in the tech industry in the beginning, at all. And would love to know just a little bit more about that. I know something about you, but would love to hear more about your journey to get here.
Yeah, well, there's a couple different chapters. So, when I was working my way through my undergraduate, I did an internship at Microsoft, and it really got me thinking about those things that amplify human potential and how I wanted to spend my life and career sort of harnessing some of those forces. And the more that I thought about it, there were three that came to mind back then. Undoubtedly, there's more. But the three that came to mind were education, faith, and technology. And that these three things had this tremendous power to unleash, to amplify someone's potential onto the world. And, I didn't think I'd be a very effective educator. Faith, I'm a Baha'i, so in the Baha'i faith, we don't actually have a priesthood, so that wasn't going to be a viable career path for me. But technology was fascinating. Technology was dynamic. And back then, this was sort of 2007, 2008, it was beginning to touch all corners of the world. And, people were starting to see technology as this sort of layer that was going to touch all industries as much as it was a vertical industry itself. And so that was sort of what wrote my story at that early stage in technology. And I never looked back. So the second phase of that really is kind of realizing that there are some powerful software technologies. Back then we were working on graph search, and graphs, of course, are eminently useful in the AI era, especially for those of us working on memory. It helps to structure agentic memory. But we were also working with computer vision. Back then, we didn't have generative AI, so it was a lot of machine learning, neural nets. And, I was playing with these technologies and oftentimes within the confines of the smartphone. And it was the first time that I started to think, for as awesome as some of this software is, some of these technologies are so powerful, but we're beginning to bump into the walls of the form factor itself. That the hardware is really constraining what's possible with this software in our lives. And that was the first time, this was maybe 2016 or so, when I started to think about new form factors. And back then, Magic Leap, and there was another company called ODG. There was a company called Meta before Facebook rebranded as Meta. It was a different group of technology, different group of companies, excuse me, and they were all working on AR. And back then, it was sort of heavier headsets, console grade graphics in front of your eyes. And I started to ask around and try to figure out what some of those folks were up to. Fast forward again, a couple years, I was at Apple, and there were rumors at that point that Apple was working on something in this space, and of course now we know that that was the Vision Pro. But talking to colleagues internally at Apple, it was clear to me that it wasn't a solved problem there either. That these are challenging, hard problems that billions of dollars and some of the smartest people on the planet were still having a hard time solving. And so that gave me the confidence to start my own company. And so it was 2019 that I left Apple, joined up with my co-founder Ben, and we started Brilliant Labs.
Very good. So, what did you study in school, and what did you do how did you end up at Microsoft for your internship? What did you do at Microsoft?
Yeah, my undergraduate was in economics. My grad school was, also in economics, management. Did a lot of research on the Chinese economy, um, and how China was harnessing engineering, fundamental engineering, and technology as part of industrial policy. So I'd long been interested in those sets of questions, and technology sort of wove its way in and out. And at Microsoft, I was a product manager on the first wealth management piece of software that was being rolled out in China, Microsoft Money. I don't think it's around anymore, but it was going. It
Yeah,
was, maybe you remember it. It was going toe to toe with
I do.
some of the other wealth management, software that was out there.
Quicken and other
Quicken,
things like that, right?
exactly, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I was running product management on that as they were entering China through a lot of China's big banks. They wanted to go through the banks to reach some of the newly wealthy in the country. So it was fascinating, and it was sort of a story as much of China as it was of software. So learned a lot, and then when I was in graduate school, I had sort of a lightning bolt moment. I always knew since I was younger that it was inevitable I would start my own company. I come from a long line of entrepreneurs, and I kind of got bit by the startup bug, and it just felt inevitable. It felt like the right time, and that's when I started my first company.
How did we also should say that you are in Asia. So today, your company's based in Singapore. You do a lot of work in China and Hong Kong. Where did you study, and how did you end up, in Asia?
So I was born and raised in the U.S. Born in Philadelphia, did my undergrad in D.C., and then grad school. I went across the pond, as they say, to the U.K. So spent a good period of time in the U.K. And then came to China when I was, for the first time, it was during the Olympics. This sort of brings us back, but 2008 was.
2008.
That's right.
Yeah.
It was a different era. There was a really exciting kind of spirit in the air. China was emerging, and the world was coming to celebrate that at the Beijing Olympics. And that was my first foray into China. It was infectious, beautiful, fascinating, and just like I got bit by the tech bug and the startup bug, I got bit by the China bug too. And China and Chinese, it's one of those oceans you can keep swimming for the rest of your life. You'll never reach the bottom. So that was the first time, and I haven't looked back since.
What was that attracted you to wanting to be there? You mentioned what was happening, but did you do your internship in China, or was it in Microsoft in the U.S.?
This was in Beijing. Yeah. So the internship was, that's right. The product group was local in Beijing. And I think rightly so. They had to have some of the relationships on the ground, knowledge of the local market, and just proximity to key stakeholders to be able to localize the software appropriately and get that rolled out. So this was in Beijing. Yeah.
When you were at Microsoft, a lot of times, a lot of these big tech companies, they're really good at hiring their interns. Did you not had an opportunity to work for Microsoft and then chose to do your own startup? How did that work when you started kind of your first thing after college?
Yeah, it was an interesting period. I was actually debating staying on longer at Microsoft. There was that opportunity. I decided to go to graduate school instead, and there were a few reasons for
Okay.
that. I think by that point, I felt that I had enough grounding, obviously, in where I was born and raised, which is the US. I had been exposed to China and learned the language by that point as well. My Chinese was fluent. And it just felt like the UK and Europe were gaps in my own lived experience, my own sort of tacit knowledge and sense of the world. And when there was an opportunity to go to grad school there, it was just felt like something that was right for me to do at that time. And big companies like Microsoft would always be there. And so I went and did my grad school there, and then straight back to Asia, because especially back then, that's really where the energy was. And the
Sure.
gravitational poles of the world were shifting, and it just felt right for me to be back in Asia and just contributing to whatever was happening there.
So you're in the U.S., spent a couple years in the U.K. doing your master's, and then in Asia, and you've been in Asia ever
That's
since.
right. Yeah.
So did your first company after grad school that you started, that was also in Asia?
Yeah, so Infograph was based in Hong Kong, and we were working on
Okay.
graph search and computer vision, and sort of the intersection of those two things. So back then it was drone companies, satellite companies. We did some fun stuff with the mobile phones. We built this really neat core technology that was able to analyze what a camera saw and pin down a precise geolocation of something, and then serve that up for a variety of use cases. And so it was really in that context, and searching across that data, of course, as well. That's where the graph bit came in. It was in that context when we were playing with some AR stuff. And back then it was
Mm,
like really crude SDKs. It was a company called Wikitude, and a few others, Metaio. I think they were bought by Apple. And so back then they were independent, and developers like us could play with their SDKs. And I would hold out my phone and walk through central Hong Kong, and we structured it so that we could see pinned locations of stuff visible through the phone's display, because of what the camera and
mm,
our core technology, geolocation technology, was be able to pin down. And I felt for the first time both the magic of AR, being able to elevate a reality that was not visible with my eyes. And at the same time, I
yeah,
felt the constraints of the form factor, that the hardware really wasn't suited, of course, to all day use. No one's going to walk around with their phone going
sure.
like this, and the battery certainly wouldn't even last that long. Um, and so that was that first moment when I started thinking, wow, there's something really special to this experience. And at the same time, it feels like it's just beyond our grasp. The hardware is not at a point yet where this is real for humanity, but perhaps this is the next paradigm shift in computing. So that's what got the gears turning.
So this is the mid 2010s,
That's
right?
right.
That's where we're at. And now, just before that, 2013 was when Google Glass had arrived, right? And so it started to maybe tease this promise a little bit, but it also hit these constraints that you're talking about. Um, were were you then aware that the fact that the hardware itself was still struggling to sort of keep up with the vision of what the technology could do?
Yeah, actually, I mean, Google Glass is no conversation about AR can happen without reflecting on the lessons learned from Glass. And I give Google a lot of credit, actually. They were pioneers in the space. They had the courage of, throwing their hat in the ring first and really showing the world what sort of a slimmed down AR implement could look and feel like. I was walking through central London. I was in grad school at that point. I was walking through central London when I heard about this announcement Google was going to make. And I ducked into a cafe and watched it on my computer. And it was kind of magical. I think like many AR enthusiasts back then, watching them jump out of that plane and live stream simultaneously down to people,
Yes.
it
Yes.
was a different way of experiencing a computer in your life, and a little bit mind bending. So that was definitely a formative moment. And at the same time, there were a lot of lessons learned. The form factor
Yeah.
and the industrial design, a lot of the privacy concerns. So, kind of on a sociological level, how people responded to that, um,
Yeah.
and the price point. So I think there was a lot of lessons learned, but I definitely tip my hat to Google for having the courage of their convictions.
Bobak, for your first company, what was the product and kind of how did the journey go, with that, and how long you did it? You did it for about 5 years. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. So for Infograph, we were going for about 5 years, and then we ended up selling the technology to someone who had better use for it in the travel space, and I went to go work at Apple. Um, but we started like every startup; it was a pivoting, winding journey. So we started really
Sure.
focused on graph search, and that was part of my interests in grad school were looking at complex, interconnected networks of data, whether that was networks of people or weather systems, companies in the financial market. There's different ways to model this stuff, and one way is to look at the connections between them, the relationships,
Okay.
and the density of those relationships as they evolve over time. And in especially in the computer science world, that's known as a knowledge graph. And so this became just a fascination of mine, understanding connectedness, how all things are connected. And we started the company first to analyze that at the company level. And so we wanted to bring graph search to uh, private equity, hedge funds, people who were trying to understand how to quantify risk and value in a market. And our thesis at that point was, okay, well, you can do your discounted cash flow analysis, your DCF, and there's a few other ways that you can look at value and risk. But one way that people aren't understanding this is systemically. It's as a company is
Mm.
embedded within its ecosystem, what is the systemic risk to that company, but also the unrealized value based on its connections with those around it. And social networks like Facebook and MySpace, and they had already been executing on a pretty disciplined strategy of realizing this in the social media and the social network world.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
at the company level, especially in fintech, this was still a very new concept. So we spent the first year or two trying to explore this, and eventually we decided to pivot. We brought it to news, so analyzing, using natural language processing to break down articles about companies and about other kinds of organizations, and then structure those as a graph, as an interconnected web. Um, and then we introduced computer vision and core location technologies to complement that, because there were an emerging market of whether it was drones or satellites or autonomous vehicles or handheld cameras on a phone. There was an emerging market of things that were making use of these data points. So we thought that we could cater to those companies, and eventually we built a really neat little core suite of technologies, and sold that off, and I took my learning and went to Apple.
How did you end up? So you sold the company, you sold your first startup, and then you ended up at Apple. So you mentioned that you always knew you wanted, before you even started a startup, you knew you were going to be a startup founder. Like you had a pretty strong bent in that direction. How was it that you obviously interned for Microsoft, and you said that you knew that you could always go to work for a big company. Um, how did you end up with Apple, and why? After sort of doing your first startup, did you decide to go and work for a big tech company again for a bit?
Yeah, I think at that point, it's a good question. At that point, it felt like I had been running I'd been running the hamster wheel for 5 years. And maybe hamster wheel is a bit, maybe it's not the right analogy or metaphor, but the rat race, maybe that's a better way to put it. Being a
Sure.
founder is it's intense, it's relentless, and the highs and the lows are similarly intense and oftentimes happening at the same time. And I'd been at it for 5 years, and I think I was ready to learn something new and learn within the walls of a storied company that was building um, products on a really profound level of excellence. And Apple very much was and is that company, especially in hardware. And at the same time, I think I was ready to not worry about where my paycheck was coming from the following month. And
Sure.
it's nice to work and just focus on what you're doing that day to advance the program without thinking about raising money for it, or going out and persuading people to take a salary cut to come work for you on it. So I think I working for a big tech company, it was as much a recharge as it was an opportunity to learn something. And this kind of brings me back to what we were talking about earlier, where I was sufficiently fascinated with what the next paradigm shift in computing would be, and I had a hunch what it would be, and I knew that I needed to learn a lot more about supply chains, operations, hardware design, hardware software integration. I just needed to learn a lot more about those things, and there's few companies in the world, especially back then, that did it at a level of excellence that Apple does it. And so,
Mm.
it was one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life, is going to work at Apple, because the people that I met and the experiences, the amount of exposure to just different parts of the operation that I had, it was phenomenal. It was really excellent. So it was exactly what I needed to equip me with the mindset to be able to start Brilliant Labs.
Were you continuing to work in, were you continuing to be in Asia when you worked at Apple? And what did you work on while you were there?
Yeah, so at Apple, I was primarily in China, based out of the Shanghai office, spending a lot of time in, 300,000 person factories making iPhones across the country. So I was still Asia based. My Chinese language really came in handy as well. Um, and at Apple, I was working on a software program within Apple operations. So that's where Tim Cook sort of, he ran that part of the company. He was elevated from operations, and they look across the entire supply chain. So it was a time when Apple was trying to think a lot more about, what are some new ways that a company like Apple, with its scale and leverage over the supply chain, what are some new ways they could think about gathering data from that supply chain, understanding the dynamics in real time across a few different metrics, whether it's people and labor, whether it's the data collected on the production line. Apple has one of the most complex supply chains in the world, so it was an opportunity, a data
Yeah.
science opportunity, really. So it was a fascinating insight, both into how products are made, but also how software and product design and other aspects of the company interface with that supply chain.
So that work you did on interconnected ecosystems in your first startup clearly came in very handy. You put that to work when you went to Apple in terms of in the context of these very complex ecosystems that Apple had with supply chain.
Absolutely, it gave me this framework for thinking, actually,
Okay.
whereby I could jump into this new role at Apple amidst a ton of complexity. It helped me to connect dots between stakeholders, whether within Apple or outside of Apple's walls, in a way that helped me understand the complexity. It doesn't fit neatly into rows and columns on a spreadsheet, or bullet points, or however else one might typically seek to structure these things. But it really is a graph, a knowledge graph that can be analyzed as an interconnected whole. So definitely, that framework for structuring complexity came in handy.
So how long were you at Apple before you started thinking, you had this little bit of a break from startup life before you started thinking, about starting Brilliant Labs?
Once a founder, always a founder to a degree, and I knew after my first company that it was a matter of time. So I was at Apple for close to 2 years, about a year and a half that I was there. So a brief stint, relatively speaking, and I came into Apple already curious about this next paradigm shift, about new form factors. And so I wanted to hit the ground running and use my time there to just meet as many people cross functionally as I could, understand how these functions are knit together, and just understand from a company that was, it is world class at doing hardware, how it was thinking about new form factors. Um, and and so it was over my time there that sort of this lightning bolt again, a lightning bolt hit me um, while I was sort of in this lecture hall there, and alongside a bunch of my peers, and hearing an instructor talk about the history of the iPod and how some of the learnings from the iPod, it was a very necessary through line to the iPhone,
Yeah,
and that for
yeah.
iPhone to happen, there had to be iPod, something that was focused function and pocket sized, and it generated learning among Apple and its suppliers that was necessary for iPhone to emerge. And there was something about that just, the lightning bolt hit. And I had been trying to turn the thesis in my head, what is that vector? What is the different path up the mountain for this new form factor? And that would drive what people do with it. That would drive how it would look. That would drive how it was costed, because I was looking at the broader industry working on it, and it wasn't quite happening. And despite the billions of dollars, despite the army of really smart, qualified people, it just wasn't quite catching. And so I was trying to turn this thesis in my head,
Mm.
and it was at that moment that I said, aha, it's got to be something really simple and focused. It's got to be, the equivalent of what pocket sized would be for this new form factor. And it had to sort of do one or two things really well and just start there. It had to be low power, it had to be extremely affordable, and sort of an iPod for AR. And it was off the backs of that you could begin to generate learning that would eventually lead you to something more complex and, full featured. So that led us, it led me eventually to start Brilliant Labs. And that led us to do our first product, which was Monocle.
Very good. So at this point, you also mentioned that you found a co-founder to start Brilliant Labs with you. Did you have a co-founder with your first company? And what can you say about, like, what do you look for in finding a co-founder? That's a big question for a lot of people. A lot of people are out there, today wanting to think about, should they embark on the founder's journey? And this question of finding the right co-founder is a big one when it comes to that. How has that been for you, and how did you find that for Brilliant Labs?
This is probably one of the most important questions. My first company, I didn't have a co-founder. Um,
Okay.
I worked with a team, but they were all folks that I recruited and hired and managed. It was something that, looking back, when I was at Apple, I did a lot of reflection on the first stint and the first company, and it was one of the things that I wish I had done differently was find someone who complemented me in a way that co-founders ought to, and that's both a like a skill set, consideration, but also an emotional temperament type of consideration. And the reason being that in the really key decisions, big and small, but especially in the really key decisions, it's really helpful to have someone to consult with, to discuss, problems with, especially someone who's been around since the beginning and has a sense of longevity in mind, and also a sense of the decisions that have come before and what we've learned from those that can be brought to bear on the one that we're considering right now. It's almost like a life partner, in a marriage. And
Yeah. Yeah.
the ability to have that in a startup is really critical. And being a solo founder, it was just, I was just in my own head all the time, um, trying my best to make good decisions and learn from what came before, but without another person to, to have the clash of opinions with, to seek truth with, to reflect on what came before with, and just to bring that different perspective. Each human being brings a different perspective, and there's something really important about that. And so
Mm.
for Brilliant Labs, I knew that I needed to have that. I couldn't do the solo founder thing again. There was just too many gaps in my own experience and judgment, and I needed to have that complementary, skill set and perspective. And that's very much my co-founder Ben. So Ben is an industrial designer, and his temperament is so different from mine, and it just works beautifully. He for all of my staccatos, he helps to kind of ground me, and we have a really beautiful, sort of dialogue between us when it comes to key decisions and reflecting on what came before. And frankly, sometimes it helps to just laugh too. We'll go to dinner sometimes after a long day at the factory, and we'll just think about what came before, the face plants and the mistakes, but also just the funny things you see when you're making hardware, and we just chuckle about that stuff. It's almost it's like an old married couple, um, that can just chuckle about what came in the decades
Yeah.
before. And there's something therapeutic about that. Then there's just something really important, that support and the complementarity. It just rounds, the team off in a way that helps the stool stand firm on a few different legs. Um, so in terms of whether there should be a co-founder in place, absolutely. That was my learning. In terms of who that co-founder should be, for me it was very serendipitous. I'm very fortunate. It was colleagues of mine at Apple who knew Ben and were able to introduce me to him. They knew me well enough. They were excited that I was imminently leaving and starting this company, and they basically said, "Look, you want this company to be." I was telling them sort of the rough outlines of what this new company would do, and coming from Apple, I think there was an appreciation for a company being design led, and
Mm.
so these colleagues of mine said, "Look, you want to be collaborating with a really top notch industrial designer from day one." And we know just the guy. And so they introduced me to Ben, and we hit it off. I mean, um, he there was a nostalgia factor. He sort of brought me back. He's from the UK, so he brought me back to my days living in the UK, and just how much I enjoyed talking about products and ideas with friends back in the UK, and we literally started with sketches on the back of napkins in a cafe in central Shanghai, and just dreamed of different paths up this mountain of wearable computing, different from what had come before, and what might that be. It was a very exciting time. And through that process, we got a sense of each other, creatively, how we were different, but also, how the jazz came together, how we were able to riff on each other's ideas, and also how thoughtful, we were able to be together, which is, I've learned is just very important. How well do we listen to each other? Do we tolerate moments of quiet? Do we tolerate tentative ideas that are maybe half baked but no less important? Um, so a lot of really fine points of collaboration like that. We just got a sense of each other over months of just meeting multiple times a week and sketching and getting stuff 3D printed and testing stuff on our friends' heads and glasses. There was a lot of ethnographic work. We would go on the subway and we would just observe how people use, their AirPods or their phones, or, we would observe that people would want to take out their phones and open the camera app, for example. Sometimes it wasn't to take a photo. Sometimes it was just to pinch and zoom so they could see something with higher fidelity. So we would try to observe little corner cases, unintended corner cases that people were trying to use the current batch of technology for. And it was speaking to what new form factors might do for people in a way that was more purpose built. So a lot of that stuff over those early months before we had enough conviction to start the company together, formally set up the entity, and we were off to the races.
You're now about to launch your third product, but your first product was Monocle. And my sense is this happened pretty quickly, especially, founders sometimes they embark on something. It may take a couple years before anything comes to market. At the least, you're often working on things for a pretty long, runway before something hits market. My sense is you all brought a product to market pretty rapidly, and I had the sense of like you wanted to put something out there to sort of learn as quickly as you can. Was that correct? How did you approach releasing this first product that was very kind of prototypical, almost feels like a lab sort of experiment that you did with your audience or with your customers?
That's yeah, no, I think that's a great way to frame it. And we're open source, so part of the ethos of the company is to be open source, and so part of that ethos is to be very experimental together with our community, knitting new technologies together, new ways of thinking about a problem, and putting that out there. And it's as much to see what people build with it as it is to learn from the new opportunities that we didn't foresee and where we should evolve the platform. So we actually, it's interesting that now with hindsight, it kind of looks like it was quick, because we actually felt it was very slow. We started the company in 2019, and then COVID hit. And it was, I often joke with people, it was the best timing to start a hardware company. On the one hand, we were thankful at least that we were not in the middle of mass production and then everything shut down, and so all of a sudden we couldn't ship units anymore to people who paid for them. So we were thankful, but uh, development was labored. It was tough because there was a few years there where we couldn't travel to be in factories, or get stuff made quick enough. If factories were open, they were on sort of a staggered schedule, and lead times were really drawn out. And then around 2021, 2022, there was this really terrible semiconductor crisis.
Yeah.
And, for folks who weren't in hardware, maybe it doesn't sound familiar, but uh, the auto industry. I mean, there were people kind of, you know, pulling their hair out trying to wonder the origins of this thing because it felt like a plague of locusts.
Yeah.
But the auto
Yes.
industry had suddenly sort of sales had collapsed in the beginning of COVID, and then as lockdowns were lifted and as demand, much to people's surprise, demand just shot back up, and and that included for materials to build homes. It included consumer electronics. It included automobiles. So cars, it was hard to
Yeah.
find cars, even secondhand cars, and
That's right.
yeah, I'm sure.
They
I'm sure
couldn't finish them.
that's right.
I could tell you a funny story of like not far from where I live, there was a whole football stadium that was full of F-150 trucks that they parked all across the stadium because they couldn't get the semiconductors, which is the last part that they needed, the chips to finish like two aspects of this truck. Like the trucks were all built, but they couldn't roll them out because they were still missing these two parts that actually made them work, and they would not work,
Wow.
without those last two parts.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's interesting. Actually, I hadn't heard that before, but it's from the other side of it. We were a small startup trying to buy memory chips and processors and FPGAs and different sensors, and the word on the street was that a lot of there were big companies like Apple and Microsoft, of course, just hoovering up supply, and they were often at the top of the list. They were the front of the line. If they needed something, vendors would favor them. But it was auto companies who were short of supply for critical chips, and they would risk buy, so they would overbuy, and just the market. There was just so many gravitational forces pulling supply away from startups like us. And that meant that we would, if we could get anything, we would every single day. I was up till 3 a.m. monitoring multiple secondhand distributor websites, just trying to find a dozen of something. And, it was chaos. And, all that's to say, when we started the company and we started working on Monocle, there were, aside from COVID and aside from the semiconductor crisis, and there were a couple of other things that happened as well that just really it elongated the development cycle of Monocle. We finally shipped in, we announced it in late 2022, and we started shipping at the very beginning of 2023. That very well could have happened a year and a half earlier. Um, but it proved us, if for nothing else to ourselves, that we could survive through the plague of locusts. We could learn, we could be resilient. We could persevere through these different crises that beset the company, and really sort of focus on the things that were within our control and try to execute with discipline against those and just roll with a variety of punches until we could get a product out and just stay focused on the goal of open source AI focused computing, and just learning together with our nation community.
Wow. How about the funding for the company? If you launched the company and you survived a couple years, I'm assuming you must have a funding journey, that goes with that story as well, that enabled you to sort of have that runway till you could get your first product to market.
Yeah, I mean, in the very beginning, it was self funded. Ben and I just, our costs were low. It was just the two of us. And eventually started iterating with a development partner in China, and so we just self-funded a lot of this stuff. And then we wanted to hire a few people on the team. We wanted to expand operations, so there was a little more material procurement, and so our costs were a little higher, and so we needed to raise first capital. So we went to a few early stage VCs, a couple of angel investors. I've never felt comfortable with the friends and family thing. And so,
Sure.
I've always felt that there is, a whole class of investors who bring value to the company because they're seasoned investors, but also they've
Yeah.
got the risk capital to be able to put into startups. And so, it's better to sort of look there rather than friends and family. So I've just always been of that mindset. Avoided the friends and family route and just went straight to angel investors, and one or two early stage VCs. And it starts with a couple $100,000, on a safe note, and then it jumps maybe to a couple $1 million, and you sort of go through the different stages of funding. Um, but in our case, when we started Brilliant, it was fumes for years. It was, I mean, through COVID, there were long stretches where we couldn't pay ourselves, and we had to make every dollar stretch, and you know negotiate really hard with vendors, and we that was another aspect of learning how to survive, was not just on the development front with making something, but it was also learning how to get creative to just make dollars stretch to continue paying for it. So
Yeah.
uh, you know, uh, part of that was COVID, but really part of that, it was, we were doing consumer technology. And as we learned really quick, most investors, they're not seeking to invest in hardware, much less consumer hardware. And that's
Mm.
because software has these wonderful economics whereby you spend a bit of time, you can build something, you can push it out at near zero marginal cost, and there's like mature distribution at this point, whether it's something web based, whether it's something that goes through an app store. The distribution is just immediate, and it's to billions of devices, billions of people, if there's the demand for it. And you can iterate on that. You can pull all-nighters and push pixels and squash bugs, and just continue pushing updates. And it's again near zero marginal cost. And there's
Yeah.
mature cloud hosting to be able to scale up and down, so your costs sort of scale with your adoption, with usage. And as long as you can get people to pay you for that, then you're off to the races. So a lot of investors, we discovered, they love the economics of that. Hardware, not so much. Hardware, there's few companies that that do that well, they tend to be very large, extremely well funded. Think of Apple, and there can be good margin on hardware, but that's not in most cases. That, we
Mm,
learned that actually most of the time, most hardware devices, game consoles are a great example. They're subsidized, at a loss, and you
yeah.
try to make up money on the long tail of games that you put out, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Um, Apple's one of the few that makes money off of phone hardware. I think famously in the phone handset market, they maybe have 10 to 15% of market share, but they've got 80% or 85% of the profits. So
Yes.
you know it's again it goes back to Apple and their model, and there's only one Apple, and everyone else is just trying to figure it out. So how much less a startup, right? Like without that leverage
Yeah.
over the supply chain, without the fit and finish of an Apple product. And so I think investors, and you could argue rightly so, they look at that, and I think many folks say, there aren't too many Apples or Teslas out there. Why this startup? You know, and
Sure.
especially if it's consumer hardware, consumers are very fickle. It's hard to do million unit volume, especially when the market is so unproven. As in our case, our market is very nascent. It's like very early innings, not even the end of the first inning for our market, and it's still very much becoming, and
Yeah.
that's risky in and of itself. So there were a few reasons I think why it was tough to raise funding early on, but we just needed to roll with that punch. We just needed to learn, hey, keep our costs low, iterate quickly on a dime, and learn how to make forward progress on fumes, and we did that. So
So talk about what Monocle is. It is what it sounds like. It's a one eye essentially AR device that did some interesting things. So talk about what that product was and what you learned from it.
yeah, so exactly. Monocle is a little clip-on device. It had a camera, microphones, capacitive touch sensor. A
How much did it cost? I forgot. I forgot how
Monocle was
much
two
was
ninety
it.
nine.
Okay.
Yeah, 299. And it was kind of cute. It looked like a little one-eyed Android. It fit in your pocket. And
Yeah.
back then, we didn't know a whole lot about making glasses. And the production processes, the design, the ergonomics of the face. There was just a lot of new learning for us, and we recognized that. And so we wanted to dip our toe in the water, and we also wanted to plant a flag in the ground. We wanted to show the industry that you can think differently about this form factor, and more importantly, it it ought to be AI focused. We were the only company back in 2019 when we started. We were the only company not only that was doing it open source, but that made this back then what seemed like a kind of crazy claim. We literally got laughed at when we would say these new form factors ought to be AI focused. They ought to be about doing
Mm.
AI inference over what you see and hear. And people would laugh. People would say, we go to these conferences, and people would say, did you guys did you miss something? Because these form factors, they're supposed to be about seeing a big whale flying through the sky or a T-Rex dancing on the table in front of you, something fantastical, console grade graphics. That's what this is about. It's not about AI. People would literally tell us, what does AI have to do with glasses? What do these two things have to do with each other? You guys missed something. So that was the early days of the company. We would be on investor calls, we would be talking to factories, we would try to persuade people to work with us, and we would get that reaction. Wait, AI and glasses? Like, what do those two things have to do with each other, guys? I don't get it.
Wow.
And
Wow.
you fast forward to today, and now it's sort of the obvious thing in the room, right? Is uh,
It's all about
it's
AI. The
all about.
glasses are,
That's right.
yeah.
That's
Yeah.
right. So there was a lot of that we had to sort of work through and just hold to our own convictions. But the market came around, and GPT published the API at the end of 2022 at the exact time that we announced Monocle. And so we knew that this was going to be big. We had this AI thesis back then. It was sort of computer vision and machine learning, and then the GPT API was published, and we knew, okay, the game is about to be upped. Our thesis is about to, start being validated on a whole new level at a whole new speed. And so we got to be on this. And so the team very quickly did a GPT integration with Monocle. And that meant that you could be wearing it clipped onto your glasses and be asking a question as you're walking around the world hands free and see GPT responses printed in front of your eyes because it had a little color
Wow.
OLED display. So
So OpenAI, they released the GPT-2, I think at that point, right? GPT-2 API before they released ChatGPT, which of course took the world by
that's
storm
right.
in November 2022.
That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. And so
So good timing. Like that's a key to startups. Like timing is always key, and you had the benefit of some amazing timing at that point.
it really felt like it. It felt like we needed to survive in the wilderness during, 2019, 2020, 2021, most of 2022. And that if we could do that, there was something good for us on the other side. And so at the end of 2022, we finally made that announcement. And then we got this gift from OpenAI. And, as we all know, the industry just went nuts. So that very much, characterized, Monocle and its journey. And all of a sudden, the discourse was all about AI. And because we were open source, people were suddenly thinking about, well, if these guys could do an integration between the GPT API and that piece of hardware, what else could we do here? And so then this notion of AI hardware started entering the lexicon. And we had a nice little piece in Bloomberg, and then we announced our second product, Frame, which was our first pair of glasses, color display, camera, many of the same sensors as we had on Monocle,
Yeah.
but it was in a really thin, lightweight pair of glasses. And by that point, AI was multimodal. So GPT-4 came out with vision, and the glasses could see and not only hear. And it started to become obvious to people what the thesis should be.
So that was 2024. So Monocle came out, had this really great timing with, ChatGPT and then GPT 2. And so 2023, you really spent learning about how that could work. And then your next product, the Frame, which we also covered in 2024. We covered when I was at ZDNet. We covered it, and I remember Carrie Wan interviewed you for that piece, and we were quite impressed. I remember that this was just when things like the first glasses that had come out from some of the big players were not very good, to be honest. The ones from Amazon and Meta and us, and not just us. When I was at ZDNet, we reviewed them. And we were like, these are pretty terrible. We can't recommend anybody buy them. And the fact was, it was very clear that AI was bolted on and was not sort of core to the product. But by that time, the Frame came out. You all were already sort of on your second generation of this. So talk about what the reception was for the Frame and what you learned from doing that product. And at that point, how was open source hardware starting to sort of be received?
That phase, when we announced Frame and all of our learning thereafter, that was a really interesting phase for us. In many ways, it was like, we felt like we'd caught a tiger by the tail. And when we announced it, it was actually right after the reviews of the Apple Vision Pro came out. And I think they were
Mm-hmm.
less than stellar. And
Yeah.
and then we announced Frame, and I think it just sort of hit this. It resonated, it seemed, because you had a much larger, heavier, expensive product like the Vision Pro, and then you had an order of magnitude more affordable and thinner and lighter device like Frame announced within sort of a week after, and I think that just it blew up. We thought we would only do sort of a handful, maybe a few baker's dozens of frames that year. Again, all in the service of just let's just learn. This isn't even a market yet, especially back then. We would
Yeah.
just tell ourselves this isn't even a market yet. We have so much to learn about what the use cases are going to be, and what this community dynamic is going to look like. Let's just do a few hundred of these, and not focus on sort of juicing the lemon and maximizing what this can be, but like just learning. And all of a sudden it blew up. We announced it, and there was a bit of virality around it. We got a lot more press coverage we thought we were going to get. And I remember it was during Chinese New Year. Um, we should have thought about the timing, but it just went nuts. Our sales went, vertical, and I was calling all of our suppliers in China, trying to describe to them in Chinese, trying to tell them, look, something's just happened. And I know that you're, on New Year break and you're with your family, and I don't want to interrupt you, but I need your help. And so, we were very fortunate. We had a, lovely group that we were working with on Frame across China, and so, we really tried our best to ramp supply as fast as we could. We were stretched in terms of the supply chain. Um, we realized quickly that there were a few key bottlenecks. The geometric prism that the OLED panel was bonded to, which was placed inside of the right front frame in front of your eye, that was heavily supply constrained, and so we needed to, that was a whole endeavor to just try to figure out how can we add more people to that process, how can we cut unnecessary steps, how can we get more supply coming in to try to feed into that process, material, etc. And our ability to deliver against pre-orders, elongated much, much longer than we thought it was going to be, and customers got frustrated, and um, that was all on the software, the hardware and production side. On the software side, we also quickly hit the reality of, oh my God, generative AI is exciting, but wow, is it subject to hallucinations and hiccups, and models would hear a moment of silence and they would respond by saying, thanks for watching, like, and subscribe. That's what models, because most of them, they were trained on YouTube videos, and so they would hallucinate. Thanks for
Oh
watching, like, and
man.
subscribe. And customers were getting these
Wow.
responses, and like they would send us screenshots. Guys, what is going on here? Why is it responding to me this way? So there were all kinds of things that we learned. Um, but it rocketed us to this new echelon that we never thought we would be playing at. Um, and at the same time, there were a bunch of other companies that were in the same AI hardware category, like Humane, like Rabbit. There were a few companies, we'd been in touch with them because we were sort of in the same cohort that year. And they had a really hard go of it that year.
Oof.
And so
Yeah.
there was so much learning, and that's exactly what me and the team needed. We needed this sort of trial by fire that stretched us, and that's what we got with Frame.
What size is the team by that time? And could we talk a little bit about the design of the frame, because it had a very specific design that looked different than the other glasses. So it had very round frames that were quite interesting. What was the size of the team that it took to pull off that product? And when you got a bunch of orders, did you have to hire a bunch of people to help meet the demand? What did that's 2024. What did all of that look like in terms of how you decided on the design, and then what made the team to build it?
Yeah, on the design side, we wanted to go for something. We wanted to go for something that looked different, that for posterity's sake would stand out as differentiated, dare I say, iconic. So we looked to the past. We looked at, Winston Churchill, Mahatma Gandhi, John Lennon, people who had these crafted round frames, who were cultural icons, cultural, political, people who had, shaped our world. And we just, we felt like we wanted Frame to sort of try to bring a little bit of that cultural resonance to the conversation, because this was the first pair of AI glasses. There were no glasses that, certainly in the marketing, no one called them AI glasses yet, and so we were the first to kind of come out of the gate and say that. Now everyone's, AI glasses are everywhere.
They're
Um,
all AI. They're not smart glasses or AR glasses anymore. They're AI
that's
glasses, right?
right.
In most cases,
That's right.
all of the competitors. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. And so, we felt that, again, just like Monocle, this was its own flag in the ground, and we sort of wanted the industrial design to try to speak to that a little bit. Um, on the staffing side, yeah, I mean, in addition to calling up all of our suppliers during Chinese New Year, we knew that we needed more support staff. because suddenly, we have a pretty vibrant Discord server, and it's mostly developers, people who come for the open source aspect and want to just hack and build cool stuff. But uh, we just knew that rowdy community, as exciting as it is, we needed some reinforcements so that as the core of us were just really focused on trying to get the product out the door, there were folks who were staying in touch with concerns the community had, questions that they had, and so we needed to beef up there. We needed to add a few people on the software team to parallelize a few tasks. And then we needed, one or two reinforcements on the hardware team as well. There were a few things, especially FPGA development, which is a very specific kind of development process. We needed someone who was bringing a bit more expertise there to knit a few things together before we push the product out. So, yeah, it stretched us, within a very short period of time. We just needed reinforcements across the board, materials, suppliers, and personnel.
How big is the team at that point?
Yeah, at that point, the core team was about 4 people, and then we had an extended, group of folks beyond the core four that were maybe 8 or 9 people.
So that was Frame, and then now you've announced the next product that's coming, which is Halo, and Halo will be released in 2026. What was the journey like from the Frame to Halo? Actually, before I want to ask another question about the Frame. Because when I think about the Frame, there's also a design choice that I think about. I think about it had this very bright orange charger
Yeah,
that almost looked like a clown
that's
nose,
right.
and you
Like
like
Mr. Potato
it
Head.
sort of yeah, like Mr.
Yeah,
Potato Head nose, and it like sat on top of those. And a lot of people sort of in the reviews, I remember people sort of chuckling at
yeah,
that, maybe even mocking it,
yeah.
loving it, laughing at it, but you couldn't ignore it. Like it was so unique and interesting that it. And when I think of the Frame today, like going back to 2024, that's still what I think about. Ultimately, is that very unique charger. Tell us a little bit about that. Was that a conscious choice? Did it work out the way you hoped? Yeah. What did you learn from that very interesting idea?
Absolutely. So, Mr. Power, which is what we called the charger, which sort of referenced Mr. Potato Head. Um,
Okay.
it was designed to be whimsical, to bring a smile to people's face. And this is still something that we think about a lot. It- as as consequential as these technologies are, especially artificial intelligence, we also didn't want people to be so self-serious about this stuff, because part of learning about these new technologies and exploring these technologies requires a sense of play. It requires a sense of whimsy and sort of an exploratory mindset. And so we always, especially when we were doing Frame, but also now and in the future, in both our hardware and our software, we're always thinking about how we can do little things, like, Mr. Power is a great example, how we can do little things to just bring a smile to someone's face and just generate that sense of whimsy and play. That notion that nothing is so precious that you can't peek around the corner, or you can't sort of chuckle at it. That these technologies should be there for our exploration and play. And so that was, yeah, very much like, we wanted it to be iconic and something that people would chuckle about for sure.
Very good. All right. So you talk about you've got your next product, sort of loading to come out,
That's
Halo
right.
in 2026. Talk about the journey from the Frame to Halo. What did you learn from the Frame? You see the industry now sort of moving in the direction of where you all had pointed the company earlier, sort of moving in your direction, but also you've got now these giants, Meta, now Google, others really coming in the direction. And we expect Apple to also sort of move in the direction. What does that mean for what's next for you all? And then how did you decide on what the new iteration of the product would be. And I believe you're also wearing Halo, as well
That's right.
at the moment. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so this is Halo. It's a lovely lightweight pair of glasses. It's about 40 grams. So, I can wear it all day. It has 14-hour battery life, so it lasts as long as I can wear it, which is, as it should be. Similar to Monocle and Frame, there's microphones. This time we have two microphones. There is a color display, which is distinguished from many of the other glasses out there, which have a monochrome green. So we just feel like, from the day you're born, you live life in color, and that's how your product should show up for you as well. So it's a color OLED, low power camera, an IMU, which sort of is the sensor that picks up your directionality and your acceleration, so your movement. And on Halo, we've added speakers. So there's two bone conduction speakers, one on either side. And that pipes spoken assistant responses or sound effects, whatever you want, so you can also hear things. So taken together, it is a pretty neat little device, and we've packed a lot into a really tight, lightweight form factor. And it's designed in service of, what we think is going to be a really important use case, which is all-day AI inference, but especially for memory. So, memory is this really important, existentially important facet of what it is to be a human, and our memory is nonetheless fallible. And I think the older you become, the more you realize that. And we just felt like it was meaningful as long as we could do it in an extremely privacy oriented, like a privacy first way. We think that's critical. As long as we could do that, we felt it was a very novel thing to be able to do AI memory that complements the memory that you have of your own life. So that means that in a way that you can trust, an agent is able to do inference over images and audio that's captured over the day and index that in a way which is, even if the data was leaked, is not something that another human being could see or listen to and make any intelligible sense of. That it's saved as a string of numbers, all the inference is happening, before it gets saved on the server, and then the original source media is tossed away. We actually don't save any of that stuff. We don't want to. So, that hopefully gives people the sense that, you can trust this agent as it's learning and indexing it for memory, but you can feel a sense of security as well, that, the data is not in a form where, the memories of your life could be read by someone else, which is a very scary dystopian idea. And so, we just felt that glasses could be and should be oriented around this experience. So we did Halo really in service of that, and of course kept it all open source as well. So for us, I mean, that's not only software, that's also the firmware and the hardware. So, electronics, mechanical, optical, all the design files for the hardware, the bill of materials, the different components and things, that's all open source. It all sits up in GitHub, because we just don't feel like in 2025, 2026, it's, we just don't feel like it's a competitive advantage to hold this stuff close to your chest. We think that actually there's more of a competitive advantage in creating a community around what you do. And a great way to do that is by sharing the knowledge that you've been able to develop through the process of building it, and then inspiring others to build on top. So then it becomes this sort of mutual learning process. And it's just so much more fulfilling, we find, than just making something closed and trying to make a buck off of that. It just feels like a bit of an outworn idea.
So disseminating knowledge, it's interesting. You're the first founder, I've talked to that sees like disseminating knowledge about what they're creating to create community around it. Seeing that as a competitive advantage is a really unique novel. Not for open source itself, but for a hardware company, building a product and trying to, build a commercial, a business off of it as well. Obviously, the concept itself is part of open source, and that's an inspiration.
Yep.
Was an inspiration for what you're doing.
Yep, it's absolutely the case that we just feel that we're living in a slightly different age now, where empowerment and knowledge dissemination, that these things engender not only good feelings about a brand, but they also create community, they create an ecosystem, and it is more powerful for people to be attracted to that ecosystem intrinsically because of the value that's generated there, rather than locked into that ecosystem because they're engaged in a bear hug. And so
Yeah.
and this was part of my learning from Apple as well, was Apple's does a phenomenal they do phenomenal work in so many areas, and at the same time, and we've seen this in the news the last couple of years, it just feels that there is an opportunity to still strive for that high standard of execution, but do so together in community. Bring people along with you on the journey, the knowledge you generate, the things you learn, share that with others. We just think there's so much more, that can be a multiplier of value. Let alone, it's again great for the brand. This is not at odds with doing good business. And we just think that we're living in this day and age where this is possible now.
I want to double click on that a little bit more, but before we do, for people that are listening to this that are interested in the product, how much will it cost? When is it coming out? When will they get to know a little bit more? Where do they find out more?
So it's early Jan, and so we're in the midst of ramping production on Halo in southern China. So the product will start shipping in a few weeks, a bit later this month. And so Halo today costs $349, which is not too dissimilar from the $299 of Monocle, and Frame was also priced at $349. And it's super lightweight and could very well be your next pair of glasses. So check it out.
So you can get them with prescriptions or without, both?
That's right.
Yeah.
And that was actually something that we wanted to learn more about this time around as well. Each product, we've identified things that we needed to learn. And so with Frame, we weren't able to really execute on the prescription side of things the way that we wanted to. So with Halo, one of the things that drove the design the way it is the OLED, the display, is internalized in the top of the front frame so that it's easy to just pop a prescription lens in and out, or a sunglasses lens, or a transition lens, whatever you want. And so we've partnered with an eyewear company that does the full range of any flavor of prescription needs, sunglasses needs. And so when people purchase the device, when they purchase Halo on our website, we then point you over to them and a dedicated site that they've set up to order whatever prescription you need, and they ship it to you, direct to your front door.
Glasses themselves the frames are now square. So you moved away from this circular form factor, very unique, that you did with the frame, to Halo is now square. It is only one style, right? And maybe talk a little bit about that design decision, because clearly you did it very purposefully in the way that you made the design with your previous product.
Yeah, I mean, this was sort of, again, in service of the placement of the display. Sitting up top here at the front frame, it meant that the top of the frame needed to be plateaued somewhat to align with the rectangular shape of a display. And so, plateauing up top, we considered, taking the rounded frame design and just sort of plateauing the top of that. But, I think we felt that we wanted to evolve and play with a different kind of form factor a bit. And so we went with something a little more of a traditional squared off design. Who knows what we do next? Maybe it'll further evolve from there.
You also went from, correct me if I'm wrong, but the frame was a monochrome green display, and then this display is full color?
No, actually, frame was full color, and so was Monocle. So that's something that we've always felt very strongly about, is that these products should always be full color, because again, life is lived in color, and we just think that the product should show up for you in the same way. So we've always been about doing full color in front of the eye.
No, that's very interesting that it's always been full color, and it's impressive keeping the product at 349 and to have a full color display, like we've seen the Meta Ray-Ban display, go with a full color display, but now the product is $800. How can you keep it at such a low cost? And you've also maintained that sort of 300 to $350 cost point. I assume that that's for a reason. You see that as the sweet spot, and how are you able to keep it there?
Yeah, well, and especially like you mentioned, against this backdrop of not only an increasingly crowded market, but certain players that are able to price it, below their costs. Um, so that Meta display, for example, especially with that neural band, and that's well below their costs. And there's a bunch of even startups who are playing a slightly different game, and they're able to price it at or below cost. So that's the backdrop, and we need to find a way
Yeah.
to be able to still make money as a company. So we do believe in having a bit of margin. That's important to have that discipline, um, and at the same time we need to have it priced competitively. Dare I say, even more affordably, uh, in line with what people think glasses should cost. So for us, it depends on which, country you're buying them in. That's typically a few $100, maybe 200, $300 for a nice pair of glasses. Um, Sometimes more, some people will pay $400 for a pair of glasses. So, especially with a good lens in there. And so, we always wanted to keep it around that. We felt that like 450 or 499, like that was the point of no return. We just felt that beyond that it just feels expensive. But if you're in like the 299, 349 price point, it's a considered purchase, but it's hopefully it's not painful. It's not perceived as you know as a painful purchase. And so we always wanted to stay around that mark. But we're always trying to work hard to see if we can do even better. I love the 299 price point. 249 would be even more lovely. Um, we'd be sort of in Warby Parker territory then. So there's something nice about that.
I want to talk about the weight a little bit too, because you said 40 grams. I heard from an eyeglass manufacturer that the targeted weight for most glasses is 35 grams.
Mm.
And now most smart glasses, the Meta Ray Bans, the regular ones, the non-display ones, and a lot of the other competitors, they're all about 49 or 50 grams. So they're a little bit heavier than regular glasses. And then Meta Ray Ban displays are like 70 grams. So they are heavier. They are noticeably heavier. A number of other smart glasses, right, tends to be in that above 50, more closer to like 70, 75 grams. So you are almost half the weight of a lot of those. You are literally about half the weight, almost half the weight of the Meta Ray-Bans displays that also have this color display. How do you get there? How much is that a consideration for design as well?
It's a critical consideration for sure. I mean, if we start with the use case, for us, it's about creating a vehicle that is makes it possible for an AI agent to do inference and learn over your day. And so that's only possible if number one, the glasses can be fashionable, can be beautiful enough to be worn all day. You should want to wear these. But then they also have to be light enough, so it doesn't feel onerous on your head after a while, like you're really sacrificing for this AI agent to do what it does. It should just feel like you're wearing a nice pair of glasses. But the third is that the battery life should also match. If it's gonna look and weigh all day, then the battery life should also deliver all day. And so, those three things are really hard to do, and that's something that on the hardware side, with every product, we really challenge ourselves to try to meet that. Um, it's we look at the weight and distribution of different components. Um, for us, because our use case is very sparse, sort of graphical elements, and it's Bluetooth only on the wireless side of things, and it's really AI inference oriented. It's not trying to show you rich graphics in front of your eyes. That means that the types of processors and sensors that we can use and then the battery that is required to power that stuff, it's all sort of several rungs lower down on the ladder in terms of weight and power consumption and expense. So we try to take advantage of that in terms of system architecture, which means that we can deliver something that's, more cost effective, more affordable, I should say, lighter, thinner, and battery lasts all day.
Final kind of technical question about Halo, which is, you mentioned that the primary use case, the primary feature of Halo is this using an AI agent to enhance memory, essentially. Uh, how do you do that? You mentioned the privacy, but could you double click on the privacy factor a little bit more? How do you do that in a way that's not saving these memories in a ways that others could access? You described it as the potential dystopian effects of that, which are very very clear. I think to everyone. How do you accomplish that? And then what are some of the like serendipitous or really delightful ways that people could experience this that you could really make and improve life for them with that idea of having an AI agent that helps you remember things? How do you think people are going to enjoy that? What are the aspects of that they're going to find really interesting that they maybe haven't considered before?
Yeah, so maybe to start with the second part first, and then I'll speak to the privacy bit, which is just foundational. None of it works without, you know, first principles consideration of privacy. We think, um, but memory. There's a lot of folks, myself included, whose memory is fallible to the degree that I forget people's names regularly. And the more people I talk to, the more that seems that I'm not the only one. You meet someone at a meeting or a gathering, and they clearly introduce themselves, and you've forgotten their name 5 minutes later. Um, and so, whether it's small, simple things like that, whether it's the details of a conversation with a colleague and the action items of that conversation, um, and having an agent be able to even proactively nudge you that, hey, these were the few action items that were assigned to you, and it's now end of day, and let's make sure we have this ready for the next meeting. Things like this that can really help to just clear our mind of a lot of the clutter of to-dos, keep us present with people around us, and still, delivering and accountable and productive in terms of the things that we need to get done. Those are some of the use cases, especially in the productivity realm. But then even like going to the store and, you have a conversation with your spouse or your roommate, and you talk about what it'd be great to buy for the house, and you go to the store, and it's a question to your AI agent. Hey, what did I need to pick up again? And that's just a memory query right there. There's all kinds of little moments throughout a day or throughout a week where there are things said and seen that can be ingested and used later on to just be those helpful nudges that allow you to just stay present with the people you're with, and it can be a little bit of a superpower for you, even those of us who forget names and struggle with that aspect. So um,
Could you do, Babak? Could you do things like what was the name of that Korean restaurant that I went to with my friend Jeremy last month or things like that?
absolutely, absolutely.
Interesting.
And yeah, I mean, it's what was it? The other day, I was thinking of, yeah, the name of another startup that we're thinking of partnering with, and I was blanking on the name of the startup, and I was blanking on the name of the founder. And I talked to them back in August, and I was searching through my Gmail and everything, and then I just remembered, oh, this is a memory query. So one memory query, hey, what was the name of that company I was talking to back in August? They did this type of thing, and the founder was, it was an MIT spinoff, and the founder was based in this city. And through a vector similarity search, and also doing some queries on the graph side of things, it was able to triangulate and then surface that precise result. And that's it. So So it's it's useful in a bunch of small ways that really add up and kind of feel magical.
All right. Lastly, I want to give you a chance to just talk about the privacy factor because I'm sure almost every person that I know that would consider something like this, they would have to have a really strong sense of that to feel comfortable with it.
Absolutely, and I would as well. And that was actually one of the things that we considered when doing a feature like this is this something that we ourselves, but also our families, our children, would we want them growing up in a world with technologies like this that handle privacy in this way? And so that really was our own intrinsic bar for doing this. Um, the way that we handle it is when rich media, images, audio, when they're captured by Halo or any device that we make, that is piped over Bluetooth, encrypted Bluetooth to your phone. And then there's inference done on that rich media to generate text, so the images are captioned and the audio is transcribed and diarized. So all of it is converted into text. And then that text is embedded. So what that means is it's then converted to strings of numbers. And those numbers, sorry, I'm just going to clear my throat. Okay, I'll start again. So that text is then embedded, and those embeddings are strings of numbers that are incomprehensible to a person, accessing that stuff off of a server, but it's really designed for the decoder of a large language model to be able to read after the fact. So if you make a query about some audio, a conversation you had, or a visual detail of something that you saw, then that decoder could then query against the visual or the audio side embeddings to be able to then respond precisely to your question. And there's certain techniques that we apply to those embeddings to make sure that they're secure even if there's another language model that accesses them. So whether it's leaked to a human or leaked to another language model, we really do a lot to make sure that number one, it's all encrypted, on that server, and number two, there is no rich media. The original source images, the original source audio has been tossed away after inference, so none of that stuff is accessible, neither by us nor anyone else because it's been tossed away. And number three, the embeddings, those strings of numbers, are stored in such a way that it is impossible for another human, let alone another language model, to be able to make sense of them unless it's a permitted query within our platform. So there's sort of multiple steps here to make sure that, you know, nothing is leaking from your life, because man, what a disaster that would be, right? Is if someone's able to basically view your life through your first person point of view. It's like a Black Mirror episode, and see your images and hear your audio. And so we thought about that and we said absolutely not. Like that is definitely not what our platform's about, and neither the intention nor the inadvertent accident that we would hope never happens. And so we designed things so that it's just not even a possibility.
And now the app is called Noah, Noa, and from my understanding of what you just said, then are you running large language models locally from the app then?
Yes, so that is sort of been a whole endeavor of ours, is getting some small models that do that inference over the rich media, the images and the audio, to get those running locally on your phone. So most modern smartphones, going back a couple years, they've got an NPU. And on the iOS side, it's called the Apple Neural Engine. On the Android or Qualcomm side, it's the NPU. And so you can run a small model there, and that can do the inference locally without needing to go up to a server. So in a lot of our development, of course, we've been doing it up on the server, but then when we ship product out to customers, we've been holding ourselves to a standard where we want that inference happening locally on your phone, so that it doesn't need to go up to the server to get processed. Just for the peace of mind of keeping the rich media of your life locally about your person.
Okay, Bobak. Well, the last question that I want to explore with you is something that you and I have talked about a little bit before, and that I've been really impressed with the way you talk about the product and what you're building on social media. You don't post a lot, but every post that you make, I've noticed, is so clear, like so clearly thought through. And what I've noticed is you talk about why you're building the product that you're building, how you're building it, and what the purpose and the goals you're trying to accomplish. And that level of purposefulness has been really impressive to me, as much as the products themselves of what you're building. And because the fact that there's a lot of technology that's being built today, and a lot of people like you and I that are very enthusiastic about technology, but when we build technology for technology's sake, or we have this sense that just by having better technology, we will automatically improve things in society, I think history has shown that that point of view can be not only incorrect, but also at times dangerous, and can have some really negative unintended consequences, collateral damage, however you want to think about it. And we've seen that, right? We've seen that with social media. Phones were built to give us these computers essentially in our pockets that could do a lot of things that we used to be able to do in computers. And all of a sudden they were able to do new things as well. Social media came on top of that. But the unintended consequences of what that's had on people's relationships, on the mental health of teenagers and young people, and mental health of adults, as well. Those things, now it's taken us a while to come to grips with, and we're having to change some behaviors, because of that. We have, the example going back to, the splitting of the atom. People did and could never, have anticipated, or perhaps didn't fully anticipate, what would be done with that, in addition to creating, new forms of sustainable power, obviously using it to create weapons. That's a very extreme example, but if you think about those two examples, I think there's a large swath of things in between that show when we're building technology only for the sake of technology, or we think that automatically it will create good outcomes for humanity. We've learned that, the hard way, that that's not always true. So what I've been impressed with is you've talked very clearly about why you're building, and you talk about this in social media regularly, why you're building it as an open source product, what the purpose is of the main features and what you're hoping will come about. And then the protections that you have in place, thinking about what are the negative possible consequences of people using it. So before the product's even been released, like you're almost open sourcing your ideas of how you've built the product and disseminating that knowledge, so that the people who are interested in the product and to be part of the community with the product can have that full understanding, and then in a sense kind of co-create, the whole idea, with you. That's been really fascinating to me, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about the how and why of that.
Yeah, it's something that I care a lot about, as you pointed out. We all love technology. It's so interesting, and especially nowadays, it feels like it's moving faster and faster in its development and maturity. But I often think about technology like I do any other object in my life, which is um, why does it exist? What role does it play, and what purpose does it serve? And I think that we ought to be thinking about technology, whether it's a software feature or a new device, in that way. And if we're considering that question, then we also ought to think about what are those unintended consequences, because we, whether consciously or not, we bring a set of values and perspectives into the development of this piece of technology. It will have an impact on the lives of the people who use it and the people who interact with the people who use it. So there's sort of these multiple degrees, these ripple effect impacts of introducing something new into the world. And on a societal level, I feel that, you know, me and anyone else working on a new piece of technology has responsibility to consider that. And so, you mentioned the smartphone and how inadvertently, it certainly was not it wasn't something that was known up front, the impact it would have on our relationships, and um, especially when you pair social media and that business model together with a smartphone, and just some of the, the addictive qualities that it could have. um, you know, that was an unintended consequence. And I think that now we have the value of hindsight there to be able to bring that learning into new devices, new experiences that we build in the future. So, I try to speak openly about this because it's not only something I care about, but it's something that I hope to spark a conversation around. Um, I just think more and more of us building in tech or thinking about tech, writing about tech, there needs to be an element of our shared discourse, which is not only about what people are making, as cool as that stuff is, but it perhaps more importantly needs to be the purpose and that that sort of responsibility. The thoughtfulness around what impact does this have on the lives of the people who use it. There needs to be that layer to the discourse as well, I feel. And so in posting about it, it's sort of my attempt to spark that discourse.
You have taken some of these ideas, about why open source, and we've talked about them. Why build in an open way, but also build with privacy first. Build with an intention of making the audience part, or the customers, as well, the community part of the process. But clearly you have these talking points that you talk about regularly. I'd love for you to unpack that a little bit. What are some of the ones? Could you mention them? The things that you are regularly elevating, as part of the discourse of the product, around the product, and not just sort of saying we have this cool product nobody else is doing. Ours is unique. Buy ours for this. You're talking about, like, our product is trying to accomplish these things, and if you align with those things, we'd love for you to be part of the community. So I'd love for you to mention what those things are.
Yeah, and there's sort of a few of them. One, like you mentioned, is being open, and we think of open source um, as much as a principled sort of concept as it is a smart strategy. We believe, um, on principle, we think that we're living in a day and age, especially these technologies are becoming exponentially intelligent. We think that on principle, it's important for there to be sort of a broad based ability for people to not only understand how they're designed and built, but also have the recourse to be able to modify, if they so choose, the software or the hardware. So we just think that there's a justice in that. We think that that's really important in this day and age. Almost like, I've got young kids, and so it's, kids being able to gather around a bunch of Legos and be able to build something and share it with a friend, but their friend can contribute to it, they can modify it, they can share it back again. We think that there is something really important to computing and intelligent technologies having a similar dynamic when it comes to our use at a collective level. So that's sort of on the open side of things, and that really is why, that's the big why we've embraced open source. In terms of privacy, it goes back to trust, and that's not only trust between people, and sometimes we are a little concerned about trust worldwide in our societies and whether that's still as high as it ought to be. But it's also trust between human and machine in this age where the machine is becoming, again, exponentially intelligent. And so, there are going to be certain purveyors of, that, machine that maybe have a business model or have an approach to building it that are less than trustworthy. And we think that that discernment is really, really important. And so we want to be people who build things that are worthy of human trust. And open source actually also goes hand in hand there. When you can open it up, it's explainable. You can understand what's going on. You can modify it if you so choose. We think there's an element of trust there as well that dovetails nicely with the privacy piece. So that's open source and privacy. But then there's maybe one more, which is human agency, and this one's sort of a little more nebulous, but no less important. We've seen from the mobile era that whether it's the physical use of the smartphone or the use of other people in the world around you as fodder for the content engine, not valued in and of themselves, these human beings, not valued for who they are, but valued as inputs to our content and ultimately to the business model of the company that runs the content engine. That's something that we've also tried to learn from, and that's something that's about to just get put on warp speed in this new era of AI, this new era of exponential intelligence. And so we really think that it's important for human agency and nobility, for the nobility of the human being to be centered, to be elevated. That even as we're building intelligent, machines, intelligent objects that are worn and used in different ways, and that's very exciting, at the same time, the heart of the consideration needs to be human thriving. What does it mean for a human being to be thriving and healthy and happy and whole? Surely there's multiple elements there. One is a feeling that they're connected with the people around them, that they're able to contribute meaningfully to their community, that they still have recourse together with their neighbors, with their friends, with their colleagues to advance their society together. And indeed, there's powerful research on this coming out of MIT and other places, people's ability to feel a sense of contribution and impact on the advancement of their community and their nation. So we think that that shouldn't be outsourced or stripped away from them, even as these technologies become increasingly capable. And maybe sort of another element of this, of course, is that the human always feels like they are in the driver's seat, whether it is over your data or whether it is over the user experience and what the intelligent machine is doing with your data, and how you're being networked to other people. We think it's important for the human to always feel that they're in the driver's seat of that experience. And so, undoubtedly there's more layers to the onion that we can unpack on this, but those are a few of the principles that we think are going to be really important and that we're trying to talk more about.
Fascinating stuff. Really interested and impressed by the work that you've done, and excited for you and Brilliant Labs team on your next product, Halo. So yeah, best of luck.
Thank you so much, Jason. Great to be with you.